The second I saw her hands on him, I knew the game had changed, and I never sit at a table without knowing how I'll win. I stepped onto the wooden porch, boots scuffing against damp planks. The cabin was just as I expected, isolated, cozy, the kind of place people went to forget they had responsibilities. Light poured through the windows, throwing long shadows against the pine trees. Inside, a fire crackled, wine glasses sat half empty, and a low murmur of conversation drifted through the air. I knocked once. Firm. No hesitation. A shuffle of movement inside. Then the door creaked open, and there she was, Haley, my wife of 17 years, standing in an expensive sweater and too much perfume. Eyes going wide the second she saw me. Jack? Her voice barely registered above the wind. Expecting someone else? I leaned against the doorframe like I had all the time in the world. Or do I already have a seat at this table? Behind her, Ben Nichols stood near the fireplace, caught halfway between sitting and standing, like a man deciding whether to run or talk his way out of trouble. Poor bastard. I almost pitied him. Haley shifted, smoothing her sweater like she could press away the guilt. What are you doing here? I gave her a slow, amused smile. Funny. I was just about to ask you the same thing. My eyes flicked past her, landing on Ben. He looked exactly how I expected, comfortable, casual, the kind of man who mistook quiet words for strength. I recognized the type. They folded the second the stakes got too high. He cleared his throat. Jack, listen. I held up a hand. Save it. Stepping inside, I let the door close behind me, trapping the three of us in that cozy little lie they built. You don't want to say the wrong thing right now. Haley crossed her arms, trying to summon the woman who used to have control over a room. You don't get to barge in here and act like. Like what? I cut her off, voice steady. Like your husband? I glanced around, taking in the wine, the candlelight, the effort. Nice setup. Romantic. You booked the place? Or did Loverboy here pick it out? Ben flinched. Haley's jaw tightened. I let the silence stretch, let the discomfort settle. Then I clapped my hands together once, shaking my head. Ah, hell. You know what? I don't even need the answer. I just came to see it for myself. Ben, to his credit, finally found his voice. Jack, I'm sorry. I never meant for this to. I turned to him, letting my smile drop. Shut up, Ben. He did. I stepped past Haley, running a finger along the back of the worn leather couch. See, here's the thing, I said, keeping my voice easy, almost conversational. I'm not mad. Disappointed? Sure, but not mad. Because this right here, this was a bad bet. I gestured around the cabin. You sat down at my table, thinking you had a winning hand, but you didn't bother checking the stakes. That's sloppy, Ben. That's how you lose everything. Haley exhaled sharply. Oh, for God's sake, Jack, can we stop with the poker analogies? I met her eyes, unblinking. You don't get to make requests right now. She pressed her lips together, but I saw the flicker of panic behind her calm. Good. Let her wonder what I was going to do next. Let her sit with it. I turned back to Ben. Got a question for you. He swallowed hard. What? I tilted my head. You got anything left to lose? Ben's brows pulled together, confusion flashing across his face. I let him sit with that, too, before I grabbed my hat from the armrest and moved toward the door. Haley stepped forward. Jack, just wait a minute. I stopped with my hand on the doorknob, glancing over my shoulder. Her voice softened, shifting into the tone she used when she wanted something. Can we talk about this? Privately. I chuckled. You mean away from him? I nodded toward Ben, who looked like he wished he could disappear. No, sweetheart. I think you should hear it, too. I gave her one last look, long enough to make her squirm. See you back home. And then I walked out, leaving them in the mess they made. I drove back to New Orleans with the radio low and my thoughts steady. No music, no distractions, just the hum of the engine and the road stretching ahead. My mind wasn't racing. I wasn't angry. This wasn't a heat of the moment thing. Haley thought she had played her hand well, but she forgot who she was married to. I pulled into my driveway just as the streetlights flickered on. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that felt different now. The front porch light was on. Emma always left it for me. My daughter might have been 16, but she had instincts sharper than most grown men. She knew something was off. Inside, I found her in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup, still in her school sweatshirt. She glanced up, spoon in hand. You eat. I set my keys on the counter. Not yet. She nodded, going back to the pot. Want some? Yeah. I pulled out a chair, watching her move around like she owned the place. She didn't ask where I'd been. She never did. She just knew. She set a bowl in front of me, slid into the chair across from me, and leaned back. So she said, tapping her fingers on the table. You gonna tell me what happened, or do I get to guess? I smirked, shaking my head. You think you're clever, don't you? She shrugged. Runs in the family. I took a bite. The soup was good. She was getting better at this. You talked to your mother today? She stretched her arms behind her head. Nope. I watched her, looking for any flicker of emotion. Nothing. Just her usual, easy indifference. It was a front, of course, but a damn good one. She leaned forward, resting her arms on the table. I knew she was cheating, you know. That got me to pause. Yeah. She nodded. It was obvious. The way she'd get all dressed up to go out with the girls, but the girls never mentioned it when I saw them. She reached for a napkin, tearing off a strip. Plus, she started talking different, saying things like, I just want to feel alive again. She rolled her eyes. Classic. I chuckled. You been watching those detective shows again? Maybe. She grinned. You gonna make her pay? I set my spoon down, studying her. What do you think? She tilted her head, considering. I think you're not the kind of guy who lets people walk away without learning a lesson. Smart kid. After dinner, I poured myself a whiskey and called Henry. My uncle answered on the second ring. Well, he said, skipping the pleasantries. She's got a man, I said, swirling the glass. Ben Nichols. A pause. That the single dad? The school guy. The one. Henry let out a long sigh. Jesus. Yeah. The line was quiet for a moment, just the distant sound of his TV playing some old Western. Then he said, So what's the play? I took a sip. I let her think she's still in control. Let her think she's got options. Henry grunted. And then? I smirked. Then, I remind her that she never did. The next few days, I acted like nothing had changed. I went to work, handled my business at the last hand, met with the usual players. The underground poker scene was thriving, and my club was the center of it. Money moved through that place like water, and I kept it flowing. Haley didn't come home the first night, or the second. She sent a text on the third, we need to talk. I didn't respond. Instead, I paid a visit to someone who had been on the sidelines too long, Elliot Harrison, the artist next door. I found him in his studio, paint-streaked hands moving across a massive canvas. He glanced up, blinking behind his wire-rimmed glasses. Jack, he said, setting his brush down. Didn't expect you. I stepped inside, glancing at the half-finished painting. It was abstract, full of sharp angles and dark colors. Been keeping busy? He wiped his hands on his jeans. Trying. Elliot wasn't the type to get involved in anyone's business, but he saw everything. He was quiet, observant, the kind of guy people forgot was in the room. I leaned against the doorway. You ever see Haley sneaking around? He hesitated, then sighed, rubbing his forehead. Yeah. I nodded, already knowing the answer. You ever tell me? He frowned. Would you have wanted me to? I let that sit for a second. Then I shrugged. Guess not. He studied me, then said, You're not gonna let this slide, are you? I smiled. What do you think? He exhaled, looking down at his hands. Just don't do something you can't take back. I patted the doorframe. Don't worry. I'm not the one making mistakes. That night, I finally texted Haley back. Dinner. Tomorrow night. The Maison Royale. Dress nice. She responded immediately. We can talk? I let her sit with that for an hour before replying. We'll see. The Maison Royale was the kind of place where appearances mattered. White tablecloths, soft candlelight, waiters who moved like ghosts. The kind of place where people came to be seen, to whisper behind manicured hands, to pretend their lives were better than they were. Perfect. I arrived 10 minutes early, settled into a corner booth, and let the atmosphere work for me. People noticed when I walked in, old money, new money, and those trying to pass as both. I nodded at a few familiar faces, let them wonder why I was there. I wanted Haley to walk into a room already filled with speculation. She showed up right on time, stepping through the entrance with that polished grace she had perfected over the years. Her dress was red, sharp-cut, expensive. She still knew how to dress for the occasion, even if she had no idea what the occasion really was. She spotted me and hesitated for half a second before smoothing it over, putting on that perfect smile. She was good, just not good enough. Sliding into the booth across from me, she set her clutch down carefully, like she was making a move on a chessboard. Jack, she said, voice measured. You look good. I tipped my glass toward her. So do you. She studied me, waiting for a sign, some hint of what this was. I wasn't sure you'd want to see me. I sipped my whiskey. And yet, here you are. A waiter appeared, filling her water glass. She barely glanced at him, too focused on trying to read me. I let her sit in it, let her think she still had some control here. After a long pause, she sighed, placing her hands on the table. Jack, we need to talk. Go ahead, I said, gesturing for her to continue. She hesitated, just for a second, then squared her shoulders. I know you're upset. I laughed, low and even. You don't know a damn thing. Her fingers curled slightly, nails pressing against the linen. Jack. A careful exhale. I didn't plan for this to happen. That's funny, I said, setting my drink down. Because I did. She blinked, caught off guard. I leaned forward slightly. See, that's the difference between you and me, sweetheart. You make mistakes. You get caught up in the moment. You don't think ahead. I tilted my head. I do. Her throat bobbed. She looked around, aware now that we had an audience, even if they weren't openly staring. I knew how this place worked. People listened without looking, and word spread before the bill even hit the table. She dropped her voice. Jack, please, can we not do this here? I smiled. Why? Afraid of what people might think. She let out a quiet breath, composing herself. I didn't want to hurt you. Didn't want to get caught, I corrected. A muscle tightened in her jaw. You think this is easy for me? Don't care if it is, I said simply. What I do care about is what happens next. She stiffened. What do you mean? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone. I set it on the table between us, screen facing up. Then I pressed play. The footage wasn't grainy, wasn't distant. It was clear as day. Haley, Ben, the cabin, the way she looked at him, touched him, leaned in close. The video wasn't long, just enough to tell the story. Just enough to strip away every excuse she might have thought of using. Haley's face went pale. She reached for the phone, but I was faster, sliding it back into my pocket before she could touch it. Now, here's where it gets interesting, I said. I haven't sent this to anyone. Yet. She swallowed hard. Jack. I held up a hand, cutting her off. This isn't a negotiation. You don't get a say in how this plays out. That ship sailed when you walked into that cabin. Her breathing was shallow now, panic creeping in despite her best efforts. What do you want? I smirked. Now that's the right question. I leaned back, stretching an arm along the booth. First, you're going to sign the divorce papers. No fight. No lawyers trying to squeeze a bigger cut. You walk away with what I let you walk away with. Her lips parted, like she wanted to argue, but she stopped herself. Second, I continued, you do not try to spin this. You do not try to play the victim. Because if you do, this video, I tapped my pocket. It goes public. And not just to our friends. I let that sink in. Think bigger. Your friends. Your family. The charities you love being photographed at. All of them. Her nails pressed harder against the tablecloth. Jack, please? I shook my head. No. You don't get to please me. Not anymore. She looked away, blinking fast. Not crying, not yet. Just trying to keep from breaking. I signaled the waiter. She'll have the steak, I said, and then I smiled, sharp and easy. She's got an appetite for expensive things. Haley barely touched her food. She pushed the steak around her plate, her mind spinning so fast I could almost hear the gears grinding. I, on the other hand, enjoyed my meal. I cut slow, chewed slower, let her sit in the mess she'd made. The weight of it was sinking in now. She wasn't used to being outplayed. She'd spent years keeping up appearances, thinking she could control the narrative. But tonight, I was the one holding the cards. She finally set her fork down and folded her hands together, like she was bracing herself. You're really going to do this? I took a sip of my whiskey. I already am. Her jaw clenched. Jack, I made a mistake. But don't pretend like you've been the perfect husband. You've been distant. You put more effort into that damn poker game than you ever did into this marriage. I let out a low chuckle, shaking my head. There it is. I set my glass down, meeting her eyes. The part where you try to make this my fault. Like I somehow pushed you into another man's bed. Her lips pressed together. She didn't deny it. I leaned forward, lowering my voice just enough to make her focus. You and I both know this had nothing to do with me. You did this because you wanted to. Because it felt good. Because you thought you could get away with it. I tilted my head. Didn't expect me to figure it out, did you? She swallowed hard. I don't know what you want me to say. I don't want you to say anything, Haley. I want you to listen. I reached into my jacket and pulled out an envelope. I slid it across the table. She hesitated before picking it up, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened it. Divorce papers. Straightforward, ironclad, already signed by me. She scanned the pages, her breath going shallow. This is a clean break, I said. No drawn-out court battle, no public spectacle. You take what's listed, and we both move on. Her throat bobbed. And if I refuse? I gave her a slow smile. Then I pressed play. She inhaled sharply through her nose, eyes darting around the restaurant, suddenly hyper-aware of where we were. This wasn't just about the money. She could lose a lot more than a comfortable settlement. She could lose the life she built, the circle she moved in, the respectability she wore like armor. You're enjoying this, she muttered. I shrugged. Not as much as you think. She stared at the papers, gripping the edge of the table like it was the only thing keeping her upright. I need time to eat. No, you don't. I tapped the folder. You sign, or you take your chances. And trust me, Haley, your odds aren't good. She let out a shaky breath, eyes flicking to me like she was looking for some softness, some crack in the foundation. She didn't find one. After a long, weighted pause, she reached into her bag, pulled out a pen, and signed. I watched her, noting the slight tremor in her hand. Not guilt, not regret, just the realization that she'd lost. She set the pen down and closed the envelope. What happens now? I leaned back, finishing my drink. No? You finish your steak. She stared at me, eyes unreadable, then looked down at her untouched plate. She picked up her fork but didn't eat. I let her sit in the silence, let her feel what it was like to be on the losing side. When I was done with my meal, I signaled the waiter. Put hers on my tab, I said, standing up. She's gonna need something solid in her stomach. Haley didn't look at me as I walked out. She didn't have to. She knew I'd already won. I stepped out into the night, the thick New Orleans air settling around me like a weighted blanket. The streets were still alive, the hum of conversation spilling out of bars, the distant echo of jazz winding its way through the quarter. I lit a cigarette, took a slow drag, let the burn sit in my chest. The taste of victory was clean, sharp. But there was still work to do. Back at the Last Hand, my underground poker club, the night was in full swing. The scent of whiskey and cigars clung to the air, low voices murmuring over the steady shuffle of cards. Cody, my tech guy, barely looked up from his laptop as I walked in. Everything go according to plan? He asked, fingers tapping at the keys. I smirked. Better. He nodded, not pressing for details. That's why I liked him. He didn't need every piece of the puzzle, just enough to do his job. Across the room, Henry sat at his usual corner table, nursing a glass of bourbon. His suit was rumpled, his tie loosened, but his eyes were sharp. He lifted his drink in greeting as I slid into the chair across from him. She signed, he asked. I exhaled smoke, flicking ash into the tray, like a kid turning in late homework. Henry chuckled, shaking his head. She thought she had you. They always do. I tapped my cigarette against the tray. Until they don't. The dealer called for bets at the main table, and I watched the men sitting around it, some confident, some hesitant, all convinced they had control over their own luck. I knew better. Henry swirled his glass. You gonna drop that video anyway? I smiled. Tempting, but no. I'm done with her. His brows lifted slightly. That's simple. Nothing simple about it, I said. But she's got nothing left to take from me. I glanced around the club, the empire I built, the people who depended on me. I've got better things to focus on. Henry nodded, then leaned forward, lowering his voice. And Ben? I chuckled. Already handled. He gave me a look, waiting. I took my time answering. Custody case came up for review this week. Henry's brow furrowed. And I leaned back, stretching my legs under the table. And let's just say Laura got some interesting information on what her ex has been up to. Henry let out a low laugh, shaking his head. Damn, that's cold. I shrugged. He gambled. He lost. The doors swung open, and Elliot Harrison, the reclusive artist, slipped inside. He looked out of place, all wiry limbs and nervous energy, paint smudged on his hands like he'd walked straight from his studio. He scanned the room, eyes landing on me, then made his way over. You got a minute? He asked, shifting on his feet. I nodded, watching him closely. Elliot wasn't the type to come looking for trouble, but trouble had a way of finding him. He slid into the seat next to Henry, running a hand through his already messy hair. I heard about what happened. Did you? His gaze flicked up to mine. People talk, Jack. I smirked. They always do. Elliot exhaled through his nose, tapping restless fingers against the table. Look, I should have told you about Haley. I saw things, but you kept your mouth shut. He winced. Yeah, I took another drag of my cigarette, exhaled slowly. You ever ask yourself why? His shoulders tensed. Because it wasn't my business. I studied him, letting the weight of my silence sink in. He shifted under it. Finally, I nodded. Fair enough. Relief flickered across his face, but I wasn't done. You owe me one now. His jaw tightened, but he nodded. I know. Henry grinned. Poor bastard. Jack's debts don't come cheap. Elliot gave a tight laugh. Yeah, I'm getting that. I pushed my chair back, standing. Relax, Harrison. I don't need a painting. I grabbed my coat. Not yet. Anyway. He gave me a wary look, but I just smirked, tossing a few bills on the table. Henry called after me. Where you headed? I lit another cigarette, tucking my lighter back into my pocket. Home. For the first time in a long time, that word didn't feel like a lie. The air was crisp up in the mountains, cleaner than what I was used to in New Orleans. No neon lights, no constant hum of traffic, just the rustle of trees and the distant call of something wild. I had been here for a week now, long enough to get used to the quiet, but not long enough to decide if I liked it. The rental cabin sat on the edge of a lake, far enough from town that I didn't have to talk to anyone unless I wanted to. That was the point. No distractions, no business, no ghosts from the past. Just me, a deck of cards, and a bottle of good bourbon. I had barely unpacked when I heard the knock. It wasn't hesitant. It wasn't loud. Just 2 steady taps. I set down my glass, exhaled, and walked to the door. She stood there in a flannel shirt, jeans, and boots that had seen better days. Her dark hair was pulled back, and her eyes, sharp, assessing, scanned me like she was deciding if she had made a mistake knocking in the first place. Jack Matthews, she said, like she was testing the weight of my name. I leaned against the frame. Depends. Who's asking? She smirked. Daisy Wallace. I live up the road. I nodded. The name sounded familiar. You here to welcome me to the neighborhood? Not exactly. She glanced past me, like she was checking to see if I was alone. When she was satisfied, she met my eyes again. I heard about what happened. Back in New Orleans. I raised an eyebrow. Did you? She nodded. Word travels. I let that sit between us, waiting to see where she was going with it. She shifted her weight, then exhaled. I knew Ben. A long time ago. That got my attention. I crossed my arms. That right? She hesitated, then nodded. She stopped, searching for the right word. We were close. Once. Before he married Laura. I studied her. And I should have said something when I saw what kind of man he was. Her jaw tightened. But I didn't. I let the silence stretch, let her feel it. Finally, I stepped aside. You want a drink? She blinked, like she hadn't expected that. Depends. What's the buy-in? I smirked. Honesty. She considered, then nodded, stepping inside. I poured 2 glasses, handed her one, and leaned against the counter. She took a sip, watching me over the rim. You don't seem like the type to run. I chuckled. You don't seem like the type to feel guilty. Her lips twitched. Guess we're both full of surprises. We drank in silence for a while, the fire crackling in the background. Eventually, she set her glass down. What now, Jack? I stared into the fire. Now. I smirked, tipping my glass toward her. Now I start winning again. The air smelled like pine and burning wood, the kind of scent that lingered on your clothes long after you left. Daisy sat across from me on the porch, boots propped on the railing, a cigarette dangling from her fingers. She wasn't much of a talker, which suited me fine. Some people like to fill silence. I preferred to let it stretch. She flicked ash into an empty beer bottle. Heard Haley finally moved out of town. I smirked. That right? She nodded. Packed up a few days ago. Sold the house for less than it was worth. Left in a hurry. Guess she didn't like being a social pariah. I let out a slow breath, watching the smoke curl from my cigar. Actions have consequences. Daisy chuckled. Yeah, well, most people don't like learning that the hard way. She tapped her cigarette against the railing, eyes narrowing. You really done with her? Haley. I shook my head. She's done with herself. I just gave her the push. Daisy studied me for a second, then nodded. Fair enough. The wind shifted, rustling the trees. I stretched, rolling my shoulders. The weight that had sat there for months, years maybe, was finally gone. It wasn't about revenge. It was about setting things right. And things were right now. Emma called earlier, checking in. She was settling in fine at Henry's place, working at the club a few nights a week, learning the ropes. Smart kid. She had the instinct for it, the patience. I gave her the option to come up here, but she told me straight, this is your reset, not mine. Damn if I didn't respect that. And Ben? He lost custody, lost his job, lost the respect of every single person who once saw him as the friendly single dad. Laura had torn him apart in court, and the last I heard, he was shuffling out of town like a man who never really knew what hit him. Good riddance. I took a long drag from my cigar, letting the night settle around me. Daisy watched me, quiet, waiting. You sticking around up here? She asked. I thought about it. The mountains had their charm. The quiet wasn't so bad. But this wasn't where I was meant to be. Nah, I said, flicking ash into the tray. Got work to do. She raised an eyebrow. Back to the club? I smirked. Something bigger. Daisy leaned back, nodding like she'd expected that answer. Figures. She lifted her beer in a mock toast. To the next game. I clinked my glass against hers, took a slow sip, and let the moment sit. The past was dead weight. The future was wide open. And this time, I was holding all the cards.